Not gold, but only men can make a nation great and strong. Men who, for truth and honor's sake, stand fast and suffer long. Ralph Emerson. Excerpts from Privileged Witness, a memoir by Air Commodore Mohammad Janjua, edited by Shahida Janjua, read by Kalim Janjua. I was the eldest of 9 children, 4 boys and 5 girls. I was born on 19th May 1914 in a remote village in the Salt Range of the Jhelum district in Punjab. The name of this hamlet is Malot. It is said to have been the seat of the ruler Raja Mal, a Rajput chieftain of the territory lying between the Jhelum and Indus River, including Kashmir, who was a contemporary of William the Conqueror. The village and its 2 ancient temples preceded him by several centuries. The Rajput members of this small community, my family among them, claimed descent from Raja Mal, who was said to have embraced Islam at the hand of a Muslim missionary. We are therefore known as Muslim Rajputs. Apart from pride in this heritage, the people of Malot and its surrounding areas were left with progressively shrinking means of subsistence. The small landholdings in a mountainous, largely barren area due to salt deposits had left people with no alternative but to seek employment in the services of successive rulers or to trade in salt. But during British rule, they, together with the other so-called martial or warrior races of the Punjab, found employment in the British Indian Army, and that region became, and still is this day, remains among the most heavily recruited. It was for these reasons that my father found his way into a regiment of mountain artillery, even though he acted against the wishes of his parents. Being the only son and the only literate Muslim young man in the vast area, his father, in his customary wish on his deathbed, had blessed him thus: "As for my son, I place a golden pen in his hand." This was indeed prophetic. My father went on to master at least 8 languages, virtually all self-taught, and won high honors. He was also acknowledged as one of the best gunners of his time. He was an expert in military law and was conversant with the Indian Penal Code. He was also a writer, poet, playwright, composer, and actor. His manifold activities in all these fields influenced me more than any other factor, and his liberal, humane nature, completely free of religious and racial prejudice, have been an inspiration to me throughout my working life. My mother, a frail little lady, but endowed with a great patience and courage. She was, of course, illiterate, but gave him all the support he needed. My father had enlisted as a mule driver in a mountain battery and achieved the rank of captain before he retired. He had wanted me to start where he had finished, so my education was planned to achieve that goal. English was vital for this, and I was enrolled in an English medium school, the Grammar School of Quetta. I took the exams for the Cambridge School Certificate in December 1932 and passed in all subjects. But before the results had appeared, I'd already taken the entrance examination of the Public Service Commission to train for a commission in the Indian Army. I qualified and entered the second term in the Indian Military Academy, Dehradun, in February 1933. I was eventually commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Indian Army, but according to practice, I was posted for a year attachment to a British unit in India, 2nd Battalion, the Highland Light Infantry. At the end of the attachment in August 1936, I joined my Indian Army unit, 1st Battalion of the Rajput Regiment. Not being entirely satisfied in the Army, I took the first opportunity to transfer to the Indian Air Force in September 1938. I did my initial flying training in Delhi and advanced training with the Royal Air Force in Egypt. The Second World War started soon after we returned to India. I was immediately posted to Coast Defence Flight in Karachi, but spent most of the early years of the war on the northwest frontier, on operational flying with an interesting and exciting aspects, further training and conversion of modern aircrafts, and on Army cooperation detachments. Due to the rapid expansion of the Indian Air Force, I was given command of a squadron at the end of 1942 and then became staff officer at Group and Air Headquarters from the end of 1944 till August 1945. By the time I was transferred to Air Headquarters Delhi in November 1946, several communal riots had already taken place. The most notable those in Calcutta, ostensibly in response to the Muslim League call for a direct action day, 16th August 1946, closely followed by Bihar and Noakhali in East Bengal. This process continued unabated, enveloped almost the whole of northern India and culminated in the unprecedented Holocaust which accompanied the partition of India and the birth of Pakistan. I saw evidence of acute communal prejudice in which my community, the Muslims, seemed in danger of being overwhelmed. My heart went out to them, but I had not in any way deviated from the prejudice-free influence of my father. I was for the defense of my endangered community and not for offensive action. My anxiety grew and I plunged into activity. I established contact with the Muslim politicians in the interim cabinet. In due course, I found them largely complacent and mindless concerning the defense of their community, which, even according to themselves, was threatened with virtual extinction. In my view, there was no objective of the Muslim masses which required aggression, but there was every apparent reason to prepare for self-defense. In this regard, the Muslim leadership seemed to have shunned the latter, relied solely on constitutional methods as repeatedly proclaimed by Mr. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and insisted that other parties abide by such rules. While the emotions of the people were roused to fever pitch, slogans called for hand-to-hand fighting, but took no account of the tools in which to do this. The Hindu opponents, however, were trained and equipped for the purpose. In those conditions, I found myself working on three fronts, especially after 3rd June 1947, when the decision of the partition of India was announced. Briefing the politicians on the state of the Muslim personnel and equipment in the IAF, actively engaging the former for Pakistan as senior representative on the Air Force Subcommittee of the Armed Forces Reconstitution Committee, above all, trying to find weapons for beleaguered Muslims who were under ferocious attack by the Indian majority in districts to the west and northwest of Delhi. It was a small but dangerous effort in which at least 3 of us exposed ourselves to well-nigh fatal military charges by taking out small arms from Indian Air Force armories. A clandestine organization took these to some of the affected areas. I had several meetings with Mr. Jinnah, Nawabzada Liaquat Ali Khan, Sardar Abdul Rab Nishtar, Raja Ghazanfar Ali Khan, and other Muslim League politicians. I was generally dismayed at their lack of a concrete program for setting Pakistan on a sound footing. The Muslim masses had been asked to support the movement and make sacrifices, which they did. What were the leaders going to do for them? Now, the people of Pakistan were to discover the answer to this after suffering much pain and tribulation. There was tremendous enthusiasm to start with in the Air Force. The slogan at the time was, "We will work for 50 years and then take a day off." In the Air Force, having taken into account the number and composition of our personnel and the equipment at our disposal, made our first 5-year plan and expansion target to be achieved by 1952. The political decision later was to have British officers as Commander-in-Chief of the Defence Forces. I and certain other officers did not agree, but decided to accept it in the best interest of our country. The British Commander-in-Chief of the Pakistan Air Force had no hand in the preparation of our expansion program. This fact and the clash of views about our national interests and the British interests led to most acrimonious relationship between me and my non-national Commander-in-Chief. And then, to my astonishment, with Defense Secretary Iskandar Mirza and the Prime Minister Liaquat Ali Khan as well. Meanwhile, soon after partition, the Kashmir conflict began. The Muslim people of the southwest districts of Jammu and Kashmir staged an uprising against the Dogra ruler in June 1947 and were engaged in a limited armed struggle. On the establishment of Pakistan, they intensified their efforts. In September 1947, I was approached by Major Khurshid Anwar, whom I had known earlier in Delhi, for help in arms and ammunition, but above all, for petrol and oil to transport volunteers to Kashmir. I considered it a legitimate act for volunteers to go to the Kashmir people in their struggle to rid themselves of a tyrannical ruler. I ordered whatever was needed and possible to give, together with the professional technical assistance. It transpired later that the organizers of the tribal volunteers were Abdul Qayyum Khan, Chief Minister of Northwest Frontier Province, and Pir Manki Sharif, a prominent and widely respected Muslim League leader. The British CNC was not informed. The PAF provided help until the Pakistan Army went in response to the landing of the Indian Army. It was no longer a people's war of liberation, and I halted the material aid. But flights by Pakistan Air Force and some civilian transport aircrafts taking mainly food, medicines, and clothing continued to Gilgit and Skardu. Pakistan Air Force pilots later flew along to the Indus Valley by night to avoid Indian Air Force fighter interception. I do not believe more hazardous flights have been undertaken by any other Air Force. A complex and tangled situation eventually emerged, the effects of which are still with us. In May 1948, I assumed the command of Pakistan Air Force for 6 months when the British CNC was away on sick leave. I had already been promoted to the rank of Air Commodore. During this period, several momentous events took place, which were to lead to my ultimate removal. I had already our expansion program into effect, disregarding my commander-in-chief's wishes to the contrary, and had refused to buy a 50 war surplus Spitfires lying at one of our depots because they were not in our re-equipment program. This led to a furious encounter with my CNC when he, unbeknownst to me, obtained the Prime Minister's approval for the release of 37 new fighter aircrafts to India, instead of paying for them and keeping them in Pakistan as part of our re-equipment. After the death of Mr. Mohammad Ali Jinnah, it became free for all for the country's political leadership. Degrading norms became the order of the day, and unbridled corruption stunted intellectual growth. I came into direct conflict with the Defense Secretary and some senior British and Pakistani army officers over defense preparations against a possible Indian attack after their victory over the Nizam forces. This, in the end, led to my removal from the post of Deputy Air Commander and made me a virtual exile in Britain in January 1949. A meeting was called at short notice at the Prime Minister's residence. This was on a day which will remain for another reason forever on the pages of the history of Pakistan. It was 11th September 1948. Qaid-e-Azam had expired on that day. The meeting was attended by Nawabzada Liaquat Ali Khan in his dual capacity as Prime Minister and Defence Minister, Chaudhry Muhammad Ali, Secretary General to the Cabinet, Iskandar Mirza, Defence Secretary, A.T. Naqvi, Deputy Defence Secretary, and perhaps some more civil officers. General Gracie, Major General Cawthorne, Deputy Chief of Staff of Pakistan Army, Major General Iftikhar Khan, Brigadier Sher Khan from the Army, and possibly a few more. Admiral Jefford and Rear Admiral AHMS Chaudhry from the Pakistan Navy, and I represented the Pakistan Air Force. The meeting lasted almost the entire day. The subject of the meeting was Hyderabad. Information had been received that the Indian armed forces had taken up aggressive position around Hyderabad and were poised to attack. The Pakistani government had been belching fire, and its leaders had made declarations to the effect that in the event of Indian aggression, Pakistan would go to the aid of Hyderabad. Now that eventuality had arisen. The obvious question was what Pakistan would do. The service which could provide the answer was the army. General Gracie replied in the negative. Nothing, he said. This was an anticlimax. My first skirmish with him came soon after. In his plan included air support in a sector we had agreed 3 months earlier would not be provided. I'm sorry, General Gracie, but you cannot have air support there, I interrupted. Why not? He asked. He asked, and without waiting for my reply, went on to make a categorical statement. If I cannot have air support in this sector, then I cannot take the responsibility for the defense of Pakistan. Sir Douglas, 3 months ago you had agreed about the role of the Air Force in the event of hostilities, I said. This particular sector was discussed in detail. You were thoroughly satisfied as to our role as well as to the fact that the army would function without air support. We were only to provide limited reconnaissance. You were to rely mainly on your own resources for obtaining information about the enemy. I continued. What has happened in these 3 months to change the situation in such a drastic manner? What? He said. Then the Prime Minister, who had not so far intervened in the purely operational discussion, looked concerned. He shifted his gaze from me to General Gracie. General, the Air Commodore is asking you as to what has happened in 3 months to make you change your army plan so drastically. I went on to complete my statement. The strength and the structure of the Air Force had not altered in 3 short months. We are fully prepared to carry out the functions originally allocated to us. I sincerely hope that the Army has not suffered no setback. If it has, then we have not been informed. The Prime Minister waited for General Gracie's reaction. The latter pondered for a brief moment. Well, sir, if the Air Force is unable to give me support, then I shall readjust my plan. This was incredible. If there were alternative plans, then why make so definitive announcement? After lunch, we resumed discussion. Having decided that Pakistan could not intervene on behalf of the Nizam, the meeting proceeded to consider defense of Pakistan against the highly unlikely possibility of a direct Indian attack. At the end of general discussion, the Prime Minister asked a specific question. I am merely a politician, he said. Can you soldiers tell me what the Indians will do after they have occupied Hyderabad? General Gracie responded immediately. Well, sir, after they've occupied Hyderabad, they will keep throwing us ultimatums. We will keep on accepting them. But the Bania will never attack us, he said with assumed confidence. He looked around as if for applause. This was accorded to him in looks of admiration, but met with utter silence. For me, it was too much to swallow. Sir Douglas, I am unable to agree with your observation, I said. The silence was shattered by a rustling and creaking of chairs. All had turned towards me sharply. There was amazement written on many a countenance. The word of General Gracie had been challenged by the youngest at the meeting. This was unbelievable. The Prime Minister looked puzzled but sat silently as if to wait for the outcome of the most unexpected dialogue. General Gracie was stunned. What? What do you mean? I do not agree with you, sir, with your analysis, I replied. He repeated his question, still unable to believe that he had been challenged. Give me one reason as to why the Indians would not follow up their ultimatum. Why have they not attacked Hyderabad all these months since partition, I asked. There are many reasons, he replied vaguely. Please, give me just one, I insisted. There are many reasons, he repeated. This was getting monotonous. All right, General Gracie, I will give you one reason, and that is us, I said. What do you mean? He asked, while the other persons looked on, still bewildered. The Indians did not attack Hyderabad area because they thought we may intervene and attack them, I said. But now we have decided we can and will do nothing. This means our bluff will have been called. It will have been proved that we had neither the strength nor the will to fight them. After the conquest of Hyderabad, their tales will be right up. They will have no reason to fear us, and you are implying that they'll be afraid of us. Then they will attack Pakistan, he asked. No, I'm not saying that at all, I said. There may be 101 reasons as to why they may not attack us, but your analysis that after occupying Hyderabad they will still be afraid of us is obviously wrong. They will have no reason to be afraid. Their morale will be very high. If they throw us ultimatums, then we must take them seriously. What do you want us to do? Asked Major General Iftikhar Khan, his voice booming with anger and indignation. His eyes were fiery and fixed on me. I was able to return his gaze. I want you to do nothing, I said. But if you are thinking of relying on General Gracie's conclusion, then I suggest you do not. Instead of allowing yourself 6 months, you should allow only 3 months. As I've said, they may not attack us for other reasons. If we believe that, or if in any event we believe in General Gracie, when he says the Indians will not attack us, then there is no need to adopt any special measures. No one else spoke during this triangular discussion. My thoughts wandered back to the lawns in New Delhi, where about 14 months earlier, the Quaid-e-Azam had stressed the supremacy of civil authority. The mere mention of the specialist opinion of the commanders by me had brought a fierce retort. Now that the Quaid-e-Azam lay on his deathbed, his prime minister had gone a long way from that policy. A foreign national was being allowed to virtually dictate the policy of our nation. Up to the end of 1948, I had been extremely strict on economy in the Pakistan Air Force, and the rigid application of regulations concerning use of all manners of equipment. An ordinary pin, if properly used and looked after, could last a lifetime. The use of transport, especially for the officers, was strictly according to regulations laid down for the purpose. Either they could have unlimited use of transport by paying on the basis of mileage, or limited use by paying a set amount. This type of discipline was maintained in all departments. When I returned from Britain, I noticed that abuse of equipment had begun. Some officers were using staff cars for all the time, while paying less under a different rule. Trucks were being diverted from their direct routes to deliver rations at the residences of some of the officers, without a charge being made for the extra mileage. These and the host of other irregularities had crept in. Above all, deliberate sabotage seemed to have begun to be practiced. The officer in charge of the technical engineering branch was Air Commodore Bowditch. I saw him driving an imported car with 0 mileage on the gauge at full speed on the tarmac at Maripur. It should have been running at low speed for 1,000 miles. I do not know when the engine and the car were replaced, but it could not have been much later. Our sterling balance had to be reduced rapidly. The British exports had to be boosted. What better way to achieve this than to destroy equipment as speedily as possible? And with no national to watch, it was too easy to do so. What Paddy Keane had failed to achieve by trying to sell us obsolete aircraft, his successors were achieving by destroying our most modern equipment. Where could I take the complaint? Iskandar Mirza had closed his ears to my voice. The Prime Minister had shut his door to me. Naqvi had become ineffective. I decided to see the Secretary General Chaudhry Muhammad Ali. I met him at his house and related all that I knew. At the end of it, he turned to me and said, "Oh, we know what is happening in the Air Force, but in a vast country like Pakistan, it is a very small department. In the larger interest of the country, we must overlook these malpractices. You have fallen foul with the Defense Secretary Iskandar Mirza. You go and make it up with him. He's a thorough gentleman and you'll be all right." It is not easy to describe my feelings as I heard this observation and advice. It was nauseating and agonizing. "The Air Force may be a small service," I managed to remark. "But if you were to ask an honest officer from each department, you will be told of similar malpractices. That makes the whole nation corrupt." I thanked him for his advice and left him. I had no intention of following it. I did not want to be all right personally. Had that been my aim, I would have been all right from the outset. I just had to fall in line with Paddy Keane, buy the Spitfires, readily hand over the Tempests to India, keep undesirable and unnecessary officers, reduce the expansion program to the capacity of a flying club, and there would have been nothing between me and the chair of Commander-in-Chief after Paddy Keane. But that was not the aim. The attitude was not acceptable to me and was indeed sickening. It was impossible for me to agree to the compromise suggested by the Secretary General. I did not know what the consequences of my attitude would be, but I had no doubt whatsoever that I would not accept them. After the Hyderabad meeting, I was joined by Asar Khan, whom I had called from Risalpur, and Haider Raza. We drove to the air quarters at Maripur. The sun glowed red as it set. About halfway to Maripur, as I left the built-up area and came into the open, I saw an ambulance parked at the side of the road. I slowed down but was waved on by someone standing beside it. Asar Khan told me later that he had been able to see inside the ambulance. The rear door was open. He later described to me what he thought he had seen. In the ambulance lay the founder and father of Pakistan, Quaid-e-Azam Mohammad Ali Jinnah, his head resting in the lap of a lady. Asar Khan said that he thought the Quaid-e-Azam was already dead. It was not possible to ascertain this. But in any event, he was only minutes away from that. Why was he being transported in an obviously ill-maintained civilian ambulance when well-maintained Air Force and Army ambulances were available in abundance? He was the head of the state and the founder of it. The Air Force had not been asked to take the Governor General's aircraft to Quetta to fly him to Karachi for his last flight. If any single person had a right to an Air Force aircraft, it was the head of the state. Even if we were to forget the emotional aspect of that person being the father of the nation. Why was he not allowed to exercise his right? If secrecy were to be maintained, then absolute observance of it by the Air Force would have been possible. In any event, Why was it necessary to maintain such secrecy? The Prime Minister should have received his Governor-General, especially in that critical condition. It was perhaps necessary to avoid ceremony, but there appeared to be no reason for the utter lack of concern on the part of the senior members of the cabinet. Indeed, complete indifference was displayed by the Prime Minister. He showed not the slightest concern throughout the day when we sat discussing what may be termed a non-event. It is not only in order but necessary to take the members of the cabinet and the heads of the three defense services into confidence. I know that I was not informed. The British heads of the defense forces might have been informed. Since no members of the cabinet accompanied the ambulance in which their Governor-General lay, I can only conclude they were not informed about his flight from Quetta to Karachi. However, if they had been told, then they displayed cruelty and callousness. I do not say that most of them were incapable of such callousness, but I believe that on that occasion they were not made aware of Quaid-e-Azam's last flight. The Quaid-e-Azam had been abandoned to die in isolation. His last gaze, in all probability, rested perhaps on the most untidy spot in the suburbs of Karachi. Not the multicolored curtain of the government house, but the heaps of filth around the slums in which the refugees and fishermen families dwelt, who were also neglected and abandoned. In 1950, Liaquat Ali Khan visited the United States. It was a state visit. He, with his entourage, came to London before returning to Pakistan. I was at the Imperial Defence College. I knew Agha Shahi very well. He was a pre-partition civil servant. He had accompanied the Prime Minister to America. He came to our flat and we discussed the inevitable question of Kashmir. The Prime Minister has done a wonderful job for Pakistan in America, he said very excitedly. I was attentive and waited for him to continue. The Americans gave him a tremendous welcome. Why is that considered to be good? I asked. He's got the Americans supporting us on the question of Kashmir, he said. How do you make that out? I asked. He began to get irritated. Hundreds of thousands of Americans came to cheer him wherever he went. His voice rose as he continued. The American newspapers carried headlines about him. He has conquered America as his forefathers had conquered India, and such captions appeared. He looked triumphant and paused for applause. Do you really believe that all that was sincere? I asked. I had questions, and that was making Agha Shahi angry. Yes, I do, he said emphatically and loudly. Why do you doubt it? It is the oldest public relations trick in the world, I said. It's called bluffing the public. It's not and cannot be sincere. It is puerile to believe that our Prime Minister's visit, successful as it may be, can be seriously compared with any conquest. I am sure that the Prime Minister has won American support for us in Kashmir. It is impossible to satisfy you, he said with some vehemence, sadness and disappointment. He seemed to sincerely believe that the object of securing American support for Kashmir had been achieved. I was unable to see that way and saw the whole American campaign of making the Prime Minister's welcome so warm as a transparent exercise in public relation. I am sorry that I am unable to swallow all this. On the other side, I cannot see the support which you believe we will have from Americans. He was really angry now. He thought I was deliberately belittling the Prime Minister's achievement. What do you think is the solution to the Kashmir problem? He threw the question at me. We allowed the problem to be created. It need never have been a problem, I said. However, now that it is there, I do not see it being solved by the so-called support of the Security Council. There is no reason known to me as to why the big powers should support us in preference to India. But let us examine various possibilities, remote as they may be. First, that we become so strong that we are able to drive the Indian army out of occupied Kashmir. This is highly unlikely in the foreseeable future. Secondly, that the Indians become strong enough to force us out of Azad Kashmir and other areas which at one time were a part of Kashmir. This is equally unlikely. Thirdly, that in a wider conflict between major powers, we find ourselves on the side which occupies or enables us to take Kashmir. This could apply equally to India. But this is beyond our control, and the decision would have to lie elsewhere. Fourthly, that the ceasefire line becomes frozen and we and the Indians stay in the areas where we are now. This is the most likely outcome for some considerable time. I paused. But we have so far not taken the Kashmiri people into account. They are the most vital element as they happen to be inhabitants of that country. And the problem implies more to them in extreme acute way. I believe that this problem cannot be solved at the United Nations, at least not in the manner now being adopted. The best and indeed the only way to achieve the permanent solution to the problem for the people of Kashmir would be for them to wage an armed struggle against the Indian army and physically remove them from the land of Kashmir, which they have occupied by force of arms. No other solution can be final or permanent. I continued to perform my duties and to attend social functions without the slightest suspicion of the events which were to shatter my life insofar as the affairs of my country were concerned in a matter of days. My wife and I attended a garden party at Government House on 25th February. Governor General Nazmuddin was no less friendly than he had been whenever I met him. On 7th March, he sent 5 ducks to our house from his collection of literally thousands in the cold freeze. My wife and I were invited by Iskandar Mirza to attend the first birthday of his granddaughter on the 5th of March. This was an excellent exercise in diplomacy. He smiled at me in a friendly manner while he sharpened the knife to cut my throat. We attended dinner at the residence of Brigadier Mirza Hamid Hussain. He was an old colleague from days at the Indian Military Academy, Dehradun. He was originally in the Ordnance, but was now Director of Military Intelligence. I've had many occasions to recollect the discussion at Hamid Hussein's house that night in the first week of March 1951. We talked about the malpractices and corruption in the armed forces. He knew my temperament and attitude on this subject. He himself had the reputation of being honest. He was impulsive and quarreled easily. That night, he fiercely advocated dishonest practices. He told me that I should not attempt to stop malpractices by our officers. At the moment, I am unable to stop them anyway, I told him. The foreign officers are in control, and they not only do not stop them, but actually encourage malpractices. But they know you would stop them if you could, he said. Yes, I would stop them, I said, and I don't care who knows it. Precisely, he said. They know that you are their senior. You will command them again one day. They will hang you and your children from the nearest lamppost before they let you stop them. They are backed by higher officials in the government who also hate you for your honesty. That is too bad, I said in despair, feeling exceedingly sad. During this period, Nawabzada Liaquat Ali Khan was on a tour of the Punjab in his capacity as leader of the political party. Mr. Ghulam Mohammad wanted to visit him and asked the Air Force to make an aircraft available. When, in answer to my inquiry, I was told the political tour and the visit connection with the political party's affairs, I declined to put an Air Force aircraft at his disposal. I sent a message that if an aircraft were required for non-government and unofficial purposes, it could be hired for rupees 1,000 an hour, and that too if it were available. I do not remember whether Mr. Ghulam Mohammad took a civil aeroplane or the train, but I do know that he went in a rage. I was unwilling to depart from the procedure laid down for use of an aircraft by individuals. We had in our depots 37 Tempest fighter aircrafts, which were the share of Indian Air Force. They needed these desperately to replace their losses and the high rate of unserviceability. While we were not to use our Air Force in support of those who were waging a courageous struggle against the Indian Army after its invasion of Jammu and the Valley of Kashmir, the Indian Air Force came in support of their ground troops. While the Indians were legally and openly in Kashmir, we were not at war with them. It can be seen that they had every conceivable advantage over the freedom fighters, the volunteers, and later the Pakistan Army. Air cover is of the most vital importance. The Indians had it, those who rose against a most oppressive ruler, and those who went to their aid had no such support. It was under such circumstances that AVM Percy Keane asked me to agree to the release of those 37 Tempests to India. I firmly refused. But we are morally bound to hand these over, he said. It is their share. They are as much morally bound to hand over our share, I said, but they do not. They offer us money instead. We cannot be wrong if we were to offer them the same. Our discussions on this subject were spread over several meetings. He argued in favor of handing them over. I resisted this obvious damaging move. In my exasperation, I had to tell him plainly, this is akin to making a gift to the enemy of the most deadly weapon to use against oneself, I said. Within hours of delivery, these aircrafts will be used against our own people. Of course, he could not be concerned about the people of Punch, Mirpur and Gilgit, and about the volunteers who had gone to their help. But I was extremely concerned. However, after a few attempts, he decided to maintain silence. Then one morning when I went to his office for the conference, I found AVM Percy Keane in an exceptionally happy, relaxed mood. 2 or 3 other officers came in to attend the conference. Percy Keane lit his pipe and with deliberate care and soon began to emit puffs of smoke from the side of his mouth. His enjoyment seemed quite intense. He was still standing behind his desk when he addressed me. "Well, Jan, I attended the Inter-Dominion Conference yesterday. I have obtained the Prime Minister's permission to release the IAF Tempests," he said triumphantly. Those were tense, anxious, and angry days. I had experienced these emotions more than once, but I am unable to recollect any occasion when I have been more angry, tense, and anxious than when I heard those words. I literally exploded. "These tempests are not going to go. I will not allow them." "Are you going to disobey the Prime Minister's order?" he said, with a mixture of irritation and astonishment. Perhaps he thought I would accept the lofty decision meekly. But I was angry beyond description. I was furious. I do not mean to disobey anyone. But the tempests are not going. And to hell with your conference. I stormed out of the room. This was incredible. I could not believe that those tempests could be released to the Indian Air Force by anyone in the government under conditions in an undeclared war. I had already said that money should be offered in lieu. I went to my room and asked the telephone operator to get squadron leader Gayoor, Deputy Secretary at the Ministry of Defense. He soon came on the phone. "What is happening, Gayoor?" I asked him. When I told him about the incident, he said that he had no knowledge of it. I asked him to find out and revert to me as soon as possible. In fact, Percy Keane had gone to Lahore the previous day. The Inter-Dominion Conference he had referred to had been attended by the Quaid-e-Azam, the Prime Minister Nawabzada Liaquat Ali Khan, Secretary General in the Cabinet Chaudhry Muhammad Ali, and some other senior British and Pakistani officers representing Pakistan. And for India, among others, it was attended by Lord Mountbatten and Pandit Nehru. At that conference, Percy Keane had managed to maneuver the transfer of the tempests. Squadron leader Gayoor phoned me later and said that he had spoken to Chaudhry Muhammad Ali. The latter had informed him that the government now stood committed, and unfortunately nothing could be done about it. Sometime in the latter part of 1948, I was on my way to Karachi from Peshawar. Landed at Chaklala to pick up General Sir Douglas Gracey. We had to attend a conference together at the Ministry of Defense. As I alighted from the aircraft, I saw General Gracey pacing up and down the tarmac. He was unusually agitated. Major General Nazir Ali Khan had come to see him off. I went up to General Gracey, as courtesy demanded, saluted, and asked him to board the aircraft as soon as possible. "It's a retrograde step," he said, if addressing no one in particular, just the world at large. "It's a retrograde step," he repeated. "What is this retrograde step, Sir Douglas?" I asked. "The Prime Minister asked to tighten our security," went on vehemently. And yet he is going to invite spies into the country. How can we maintain security that way? I had no idea about the subject under reference, so I asked him to enlighten me on it. The Prime Minister has decided to exchange diplomatic relations with Russia, he said. They will have a network of military espionage. Our security will be in jeopardy. I was surprised by this observation and attitude. I could not conceal my surprise and agitation. It was being suggested by a very influential non-national that Pakistan, an independent nation of over 100 million people, the largest Islamic nation in the world, should not be free to pursue her own foreign policy. Have you an embassy in Moscow? I asked abruptly. He looked at me sharply, with an exclamation mark written right across his face. Yes, he said. Do the Russians have an embassy in London? I asked. Yes, he said a little thoughtfully. Similarly, I believe there are American, Canadian, French and other Western embassies in Moscow and Russian embassies in Western capitals, I said. And he listened seriously. If Russia is secure with all these hostile embassies located in Moscow, if the security of all these countries is not jeopardized by the presence of Russian embassies, then surely the security of our country cannot be in peril. Exchange of ambassadors between two countries merely means that they recognize each other and would like to maintain friendly or diplomatic relations. General Gracie remained silent, but glum as I spoke. Pakistan and Russia are not more hostile as countries than Britain and above all America and Russia, I continued. I think, Sir Douglas, that this is a matter for the government of Pakistan to decide. Should they believe that their relations are cordial and future relationship would be in the benefit of the country, then they must naturally exchange ambassadors. General Gracie had already moved towards the aircraft. Mohammad Khan Janjua, Mard-e-Mujahid, designed the first Air Force crest with a Shaheen and the following verse. Sairast ke daryast, te baal o parmast. Roughly translated, it is, be it a desert or a river, it's beneath our wings. He also chose the motto for the Air Force, which is a symbol for the pride of the nation. Long live Pakistan. Long live the spirit of Mohammad Khan Janjua.